take a drink of water. All right. The Pale Blood Hunt, a blood-borne analysis by Redgrave. Dedicated to all those with a story to tell. I didn't really like Dark Souls. Objectively speaking, it's a great game. The gameplay is solid, the world is compelling, the characters are interesting. Maybe it's because, Demon Souls fanatic that I had hyped the game up in my mind to such impossibly high standards that there was no way it could compete with my expectations. But I always found that there was something missing in Dark Souls. The unknown. The story of Dark Souls is certainly mysterious. The game avoided conventional storytelling, and instead gave the player the burden of uncovering the truth on their own. One could pull back the curtain of Anorlando and discover the machinations of Gwendolen and Frompt, or bring the Lord Vessel to Koth and learn of another layer to the story. Even so, the story of Dark Souls was all too grounded for me. It was the kind of story that could be rearranged and presented as fact, with all of the mysteries solved like a novel, where at the end of the book, the brilliant detective goes over the evidence to the rest of the characters and makes all the connections for them. Demon's Souls had been different. In Demon's Souls, the answers hadn't been there. It's no mystery that the concept of Souls lore hunting didn't really exist when Demon's Souls, other than a few notable exceptions like Guardian Owl. The only real topic of debate was whether or not the Old One was the god of the Church. But there was no answer to whether the Monumental was good or evil. There was no explanation for how Bior's armor could be found in Meralda's well. The mysteries behind Lord Rydell and the old monk remained void of answers. They were unknown. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the genius behind the Souls franchise, grew up in poverty in the city of Shizuoka. Unable to afford any means of entertaining himself, Miyazaki would spend most of his childhood reading books found in his local library. He was fascinated with the Western tales of fiction, but his English was not fluent enough to understand every single word. Many times he would read a story and find that he couldn't understand half of it, and so he would connect the words he could find and fill in the blanks, forming a story of his own that used the pieces that had been laid out before him. I've read many criticisms of Bloodborne's story when compared with Dark Souls. Many people find that the characters are empty, that the story isn't as entertaining, or that the plot doesn't seem to be as rich when compared to the tale of Gwyn and the First Flame. And they're right. Bloodborne, like Demon's Souls before it, doesn't have the answers to be solved within the game itself. There's no dialogue or item description which can provide the player with that crucial piece of information that explains everything. There's no brilliant detective who can explain it for someone in a condensed manner. Bloodborne is a book where half of the words can't be understood, and the reader must fill in the blanks on their own. When I first wrote The Pale Blood Hunt, I wrote that there was a singular truth we could discover. 7 months later, having read so many different interpretations and discussion on the game's story, having discussed the plot with so many different people, I can only now see how absurd that the idea of a singular story had been. There is no answer to Bloodborne's story. Bloodborne is a game that asks you what you think. It asks you what your story is. What do you make of the unknown? This is my story. This is my eldritch truth. Quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." End quote. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, from Supernatural Horror in Literature, published 1927. For starters, I will use only information and evidence that can be found inside of the game. I will save my personal interpretations and beliefs for the end, so that you can make up your own mind about the evidence presented. Chapter 1. Byrgenwerth, Cos, and the vacuous spider. Quote, Byrgenwerth is an old place of learning, and the tomb of the gods, carved out below Yarnum, should be familiar to every hunter. Well, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. In this sense, everything sacred in Yarnum can be traced back to Byrgenwerth. End quote. Alfred, Vileblood Hunter. Everything begins at Byrgenwerth. An old institution of learning, Byrgenwerth was built in a peaceful, secluded area away from the neighboring city and close to a great lake. It is here that a group of individuals studied and explored the depths of human knowledge. There were many students at Byrgenwerth. There were, however, certain individuals of note other than the students, figures of importance who formed the inner circle, so to speak. While not all of them were scholars, for the purpose of this analysis, I refer to this group of individuals as the Byrgenwerth scholars, or the scholars for short. Those individuals who we can safely conclude were members of the scholars consisted of Willem, Lawrence, Michelash, and Carroll. Master Willem was the head of the academy and a highly respected figure. All characters who refer to Willem specifically refer to Master Willem, indicating a deep respect for the figure even if they had differences in beliefs. There is also a reference found on the Rune Workshop tool which refers to him as Provost Willem. A provost is an administrator of an academic facility which supports placing Willem as the head of the academy and the leading figure. Master Willem's primary focus of study concerned the limits of human intelligence. Lawrence is a much more enigmatic figure, especially for a character so important. From the beast skull in the Grand Cathedral, the player character Hunter witnesses a memory of an encounter between Lawrence and Willem, in which Willem accuses the younger Lawrence of betraying him. A note left on the cathedral staircase reads, quote, Place your hand on the altar's sacred covering, and inscribe Master Lawrence's adage upon your flesh. End quote. That Lawrence would be so revered, so highly, infers that he must have been a very significant figure in the healing church. It is well documented that the healing church has its roots in Byrgenwerth College. The Byrgenwerth student uniform states, quote, The healing church has its roots in Byrgenwerth, and naturally borrows heavily from its uniform design. The focus not on knowledge or thought, but on pure pretension, would surely bring Master Willem to despair, if only he knew. End quote. Lawrence's title is that of the first vicar, given to him both by the human skull of the nightmare and in his boss fight, confirming this idea that Lawrence was in fact one of the church's founders, splitting from Byrgenwerth in an event that I will later describe as the schism. Michelash, the boss encountered in the Nightmare of Mensis, was another scholar, as evidenced by the tattered Byrgenwerth uniform he wears during the player character Hunter's fight against him. Michelash also makes reference to other parts of Byrgenwerth, which I will discuss later. Carroll was a genius runesmith who, through unknown methods, could listen to the scratchings and utterings of the Great Ones. While she could not understand the inhuman words they spoke, she managed to etch them into visual symbols that could be identified. The Rune Workshop tool describes Carroll as, quote, Runesmith Carroll, student of Byrgenwerth, transcribed the inhuman utterings of the Great Ones into what are now called Carroll runes. End quote. There are also two individuals whom we can believe to have been a member of the scholars, Gehrman and Maria. Gehrman was most assuredly an acquaintance of both Lawrence and Willem. After the player character Hunter defeats Rom, the vacuous spider, they can find Gehrman whimpering in his sleep, quote, Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody help me, end quote. Gehrman is also, as we know, the first hunter. He founded the workshop, located in a hidden section of the upper cathedral ward, and presumably worked with the church in its infancy. Judging from Gehrman's combat proficiency and master craftsmanship, he may have been a bodyguard for tomb excavations, a groundskeeper, or a handyman for the college at large. Maria was Gehrman's greatest pupil, and judging from the fact that she takes over the research hall of the Healing Church, it's possible that she was a student at the college under Lawrence. Regardless, her participation in the events which would take place at the Hamlet place her as a member of the Byrgenwerth scholars prior to its schism. We can now look at the scholars, having explored each one individually, as a collective unit. Willem, Lawrence, Micolash, Gehrman, Maria, and Carol were individuals at the Byrgenwerth College, an institution dedicated to the furthering of knowledge and the exploration of the massive labyrinth built underground. It was in this labyrinth that the scholars made the discovery that put every event in Bloodborne into motion. Indeed, the entire history of Bloodborne can be traced to a single defining moment, in which the scholars discovered something deep inside the ancient Temerian crypts. The executioner Alfred muses that, quote, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. End quote. Deep inside the labyrinth, the scholars discovered the old blood. It is unclear exactly what was found, but in the upper level of the Byrgenwerth mansion we can find the empty phantasm shell. Quote, empty invertebrate shell that is said to be a familiar of a great one. The Healing Church has discovered a great variety of invertebrates, or phantasms as they are called. End quote. Whatever was found, it was proof of the existence of the Great Ones. It's possible that the scholars discovered Ebritus, the abandoned and left behind Great One who would later commune with the Healing Church. They certainly discovered a source of the old blood, the tainted blood of the Great Ones. Whether it was Ebritus or something else is unclear. With the discovery of the old blood and of the Great Ones, everything changed. Evolution became the goal. Push the limits of humanity and become something greater. Ascend to the level of the Great Ones. Push humanity into its next stage. A scribbled note found in the Nightmare Lecture Hall reads, quote, Master Willem was right. Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race. End quote. However, it quickly became apparent that some of the scholars, and Lawrence in particular, differed in their belief on how the evolution should be carried out. Carroll's eye rune states, quote, eyes symbolize the truth Master Willem sought in his research. Disillusioned by the limits of human intellect, Master Willem looked to beings from higher planes for guidance, and sought to line his brain with eyes in order to elevate his thoughts. End quote. However, Carroll's Metamorphosis rune states, quote, the discovery of blood made their dream of evolution a reality. Metamorphosis and the excesses and deviation that followed was only the beginning. End quote. There are two different resources that the player collects during their time in Bloodborne: blood echoes and insight. The echoes is the method in which the player character hunter gains power, while insight is the method in which the player character hunter gains knowledge. While some at Byrgenwerth believed that knowledge and understanding of the Great Ones and the higher planes of existence would lead to humanity's uplifting, others believed that it was through the imbibing and fusing with the old blood that would lead to humanity's ascension. This was a concept anathema to everything Willem stood for. Quote, fear the old blood. End quote. These two fundamentally opposed philosophies would lead to the Byrgenwerth schism. But there's another piece of the puzzle. Upon entering the fishing hamlet in the Hunter's Nightmare, the player character Hunter is greeted by a fish kin, muttering to himself, quote, Byrgenwerth, Byrgenwerth, blood-crazed murderers, blasphemous fiends. End quote. If the player is wearing the milkweed rune, the kin will give them the accursed brew, a skull which states, quote, "Skull of a local from the violated fishing village. The inside of the skull was forcibly searched for eyes, as evidenced by innumerable scratchings and indentations." End quote. Whatever happened in the fishing hamlet must have had to do with Kos, the great one found at the end of the area. Kos is apparently dead, and while the hunter battles her orphan, the great one is long since passed. Other than the mutterings of the fishkin, there is only one other reference to Kos, that of Mikolash in his commune with the cosmos. Quote, "Ah, Kos, or some say Cosm, do you hear our prayers, as you once did for the vacuous Ram? Grant us eyes, grant us eyes." End quote. Ram, as the player character encounters, is a large creature who is found at the bottom of the moonside lake of Byrgenwerth. Ram's title is that of the vacuous spider, and is shown to be relatively weak. Ram's only real strength comes from the spider kin she can spawn to defend herself. Other than that, she is barely capable of defending herself either through carelessly hurling shards of energy or thrashing wildly at her enemy. When the player encounters Ram, it is the defining moment in which the story of Bloodborne goes from a narrative of hunting beasts to a sudden understanding that we, the player, have barely even scratched the surface of a much, much darker truth. But Ram is not a fully developed Great One. Mikolash, in his communing with the cosmos, mutters, quote, "As you once did for the vacuous Ram, grant us eyes, grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy." End quote. Ram was not always a great one. Eyes planted on her brain to cleanse her idiocy, Ram ascended to become one. Vacuous is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as having or showing a lack of thought or intelligence, mindless. The word comes from the Latin vacus, meaning empty, along with the suffix us, meaning by the nature of. Where does Ram come from? Who is she? What is her relation to the dead Great One Kos? What follows is purely my own interpretation and belief based on the evidence I have gathered. Do not consider any of this as solid fact. Instead, use it as my interpretation, so that you can gather your own beliefs. In Byrgenwerth, Master Willem and his students toiled away to excavate the Temerian labyrinth underground, studying their gods and exploring the depths of human intellect. The Byrgenwerth scholars made two major breakthroughs in their study. Their first major discovery was the old blood, specifically the blood of a Great One. It's possible that this Great One was a Breedis. As in the Byrgenwerth lecture hall, we can discover the auger of a Breedis. And we also find the empty phantasm shell in the upper chamber of the Byrgenwerth mansion. The second great discovery was Kos. When I first played the Old Hunters DLC, my initial impression had been that it was the Byrgenwerth scholars who had killed Kos. When I shared this theory, many people pointed to the description of the Kos parasite, which states, quote, "When the carcass of Kos washed up on the coast, its insides were teeming with tiny parasites, unlike any found in humans." End quote. The argument was that this gave evidence to the fact that Kos had actually been dead prior to the encounter with Byrgenwerth, having washed up on the coast of the fishing village. I was unsure about my conclusion and couldn't decide which theory was more accurate until I played through the DLC a second time and encountered Maria. Her words, now that I have seen the entire picture, made much more sense. Quote, "A corpse should be left well alone. Oh, I know very well how the secrets beckon so sweetly." End quote. When I first encountered Maria, I had naturally assumed she was talking about her own corpse. Now that I had seen what lay beyond her care, everything fell into place. As I wandered around the fishing hamlet, taking a look at its design and features, I came to a new conclusion. Look at how the kin of the hamlet throw their harpoons, how the giants wield massive anchors, how the wrecks of mighty vessels line the coast. This isn't some quaint fishing village. It's a whaling town. Prior to the release of the DLC, many players had noted the strange masts sticking out of the water in the Nightmare Frontier. We can now see the origin of these vessels, the Hamlet. The villagers must have sighted the Great One Kos in the sea one day, rising up and taking arms to kill what they must have perceived as a monster. They hunted and killed her, losing many of their whaling ships in the process, but inevitably returning home victorious, having sent the creature back to the sea. But one day, the corpse of the dead Great One washed ashore. When the villagers investigated the corpse, they found it teeming with parasites, which soon infected and took over the minds and bodies of the villagers, transforming them into the kin that we encounter them as. Inevitably, word reached Byrgenwerth of the dead god on the Hamlet. They sent 2 individuals to investigate the Hamlet, Gehrman and Maria. The announcement trailer featured Gehrman with his scythe extended, walking into the Hamlet, and we find Rakuyo, Maria's weapon, in the Hamlet well. Gehrman, the first hunter, traveled along with his greatest pupil, Maria, to the Hamlet and butchered the kin. The skulls were split open in search of eyes, and the first hunters carved a path towards the corpse of Kos. It is there that their greatest blasphemy was committed. The elevator to the Healing Church Research Hall depicts 3 statues hovering over a child, examining it. The central figure is clearly a depiction of Master Willem, featuring the same robes and hat as the provost's. Gehrman and Maria discovered that the dead Kos had been pregnant, the unborn fetus still intact. A very important rule of Bloodborne's world is that even if an individual dies in the waking world, their consciousness may still remain in the dreamlands. This is something that will come up time and time again, and is evidenced by the existence of Mikolash's corpse in the waking world. The unborn, murdered Great One was brought back to the Byrgenwerth College and dissected in the name of science. What was retrieved was a cord of the eye, the orphan's umbilical cord. And it was then that Master Willem, the greatest mind of Byrgenwerth, had an epiphany. Willem is quoted in the description of the Great One's wisdom as having stated, quote, "We are thinking on the basest of planes. What we need are more eyes." End quote. The eye is indeed the symbol representing not just insight in the player's heads-up display, but also the knowledge of the higher planes of existence and of the Great Ones. The discovery of the Great Ones in the Old Blood split the scholars into 2 opposing factions. One I have dubbed the Loyalists, led by Master Willem. The Loyalists believed in evolution through eyes, the accumulation of insight that would let humanity ascend. This faction consisted of Willem and his students. The other faction, which I have dubbed the Radicals, was led by Lawrence. The Radicals believed in evolution through blood, the accumulation of power that would let humanity ascend. This faction consisted of Lawrence, Mikolash, Gehrman, and Maria. While there was never any violence between these 2 groups, the fundamental difference in philosophy led to them inevitably separating to go their own paths. While the Loyalists remained at Byrgenwerth, the Radicals founded the Healing Church in the pursuit of further spreading their knowledge of the Old Blood. This schism was not also purely among the scholars, but also amongst the student populace, with many leaving along with the Radicals. With the Healing Church founding and flourishing, Willem and the remaining Loyalists were no doubt concerned with the growing power and the threat they posed. The Loyalists were fully aware that the actions of the Healing Church in their use of the Old Blood would lead to the spread of the Scourge. While the Healing Church spread throughout Yharnam, Willem and the remaining Loyalists got to work on their own research. This is where things get fuzzy, as there is very little information available on this crucial point in time. What we can see, however, are the results of the Loyalists' research. If the player character Hunter encounters Yosefka, or rather the impostor Yosefka, after the blood moon has risen. Killing her will make her drop a cord of the eye, which states, quote, Provost Willem sought the cord in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a great one. By lining his brain with eyes, the only choice he knew, if man were to ever match their greatness. End quote. When the player character Hunter first enters the Byrgenwerth mansion, they encounter on the second floor an NPC hunter named Yuri, who appears to be a member of the choir, the highest-ranking members of the Healing Church. Yuri wields a call beyond, the choir's ultimate weapon, and wears the blindfold cap and the attire of a choir member. This would show that the choir returned to the ruins of Byrgenwerth from time to time in order to gather old research notes or artifacts. That the impostor Yosefka, who wields a weapon of the choir, an augur of Abridus, would be in possession of an artifact that once belonged to Master Willem can be explained as such. The choir recovered this cord, the umbilical cord of the Orphan of Kos. Willem had used the cord in order to further his research, delving deeper and deeper into the depths of human understanding. During this point in time, with intense research into the Great Ones being conducted at Byrgenwerth, the students were twisted and transformed into gardens of eyes for Willem's research. Bizarre kin of the cosmos who would wander the grounds. Only 4 individuals were left intact: Willem, Doris the Graveguard, the unnamed doorman who would be entrusted with the password, and Rom. Whatever happened to Carol is unclear. She may have left with Lawrence. She may have been transformed along with the student body. Or she may have left Byrgenwerth at an unspecified time to continue her research separately. However, thanks to Carol's transcriptions of the inhuman utterings of the Great Ones, the Loyalists learned of the importance and the power held by great bodies of water. If we take a look at any of the lake or sea runes, we can find the description, quote, Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep, and an augur of the eldritch truth. Overcome this hindrance and seek what is yours. End quote. This even matches the game mechanics, in which runes representing water provide defense and resistance. Quote, The grand lake of mud, hidden now from sight. End quote. Mikolash. Master Willem's last great ritual ascended Rom into that of a newly formed Great One. Placed at the bottom of the Moonside Lake, Rom's empty mind served as a shield for our physical plane, protected by the great body of water. It prevented the beckoning of the moon presence by Lawrence's healing church. With his knowledge and understanding of the Great Ones, Willem was able to use the orphan's cord to rebirth a new Great One, and line her brain with eyes, using her as a living bulwark to seal away the Great Ones, the Nightmare, and the Blood Moon. But where did she come from? We have already determined that the word vacuous means empty, mindless. This can very easily be attributed to a simpleton, or to a brain-dead being. Rom, however, certainly does not seem to be brain-dead. While she is weak, she most certainly attempts to defend herself in the meager ways she has. In the interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki, found in the official guide, Miyazaki was asked what his favorite boss was. His answer was Rom. But that in itself, while interesting, was not very striking. However, the specifics of his response were unexpected. Quote, I really like her. There are some oddly cute aspects of her moves and modeling. End quote. There is another type of being that is blank, empty. As John Locke writes, human beings are born tabula rasa, a blank slate. Empty beings that are given shape by our experiences. A being that can be described as being cute, weak, helpless, and empty of thoughts, lacking of experience. An infant. From Miyazaki's interview, quote, In the world of Bloodborne, babies that are treated as special in one way or the other are offered as lures to the Great Ones. The Great Ones have all lost their children because of their positions, and as a result, they're attracted to these special babies. The babies are one way of calling them. End quote. The hunter can find a note in Yahargul left by a dead hunter, which reads, quote, "Nightmarish rituals crave a newborn. Find one, and silence its harrowing cry." End quote. The first instinct of the player is to associate this with the school of Mensis. They must have been using some child to perform the ritual. But Mikolash and his students are only following in the footsteps of Master Willem, trying to reproduce the success of the loyalists of Byrgenwerth. Quote, "As you once did for the vacuous Rom, grant us eyes, grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy." End quote. Rom is not a great one. In fact, Bloodborne causes understandable confusion in that it refers to many different species, factions, and groups as belonging to the singular group, the Great Ones. But the kin, ascended mortals who bleed a clear serum, are not fully fledged, complete, and whole Great Ones like the Moon Presence, the Wet Nurse, or the Orphan. They are merely kin of the cosmos. Killing Rom does not drop a Great One cold blood. Killing Rom drops a kin cold blood. Rom, daughter of Willem, either literally or metaphorically, born from the fruits of his research and used to ascend. Look at the way she moves, desperately backing away from the hunter. She seems almost infantile. Unlike the rest of the kin that are encountered, Rom has no natural defense mechanisms other than her ability to manipulate energy. If you ask me, she doesn't look like a spider at all. She looks like a caterpillar, the infant form of a butterfly, one that may have become beautiful.